Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And welcome. I'll try not to speak as loudly as I do sometimes. There we are. Good afternoon, and welcome to this talk under the auspices of the Center for International Policy Studies here at the University of Ottawa. My name is Michael Williams. I'm from the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and it's my great pleasure today to welcome one of the, I think, most interesting and prominent and significant thinkers on contemporary British politics working in the field today, Professor Richard Wyn Jones. It is, I think, a cliche to say that British politics are fast moving these days. Everybody likes to say that 2 weeks ago, we had Prime Minister Boris and Queen Elizabeth, and now we have Liz Truss and Charles III. But there's obviously been much bigger transformations than that. Brexit, the rise of devolution, nationalist politics, and a wide variety of other phenomena, including the remarkable rise of what our speaker is going to speak about today, Englishness and its impact on British politics. Richard Wyn Jones is Professor of Politics at Cardiff University and Director of the Centre for the Study of Wales.
Wales Governance Centre.
The Wales Governance Centre,
Close
sorry.
enough.
Yeah.
Close enough.
Also in Cardiff, the author of more publications than I will particularly even try to lay out today, a very important and significant contributor to public debate on these issues, both in Wales and across the UK, and the author, just so I can plug it a tiny bit, of a book surprisingly called Englishness, the Political Force Transforming Britain, with his co-author, Ailsa Henderson. So that is enough for me. Richard, I will turn it over to you and then to our audience.
Thank you.
Have you turned
so
on?
Much. I think I'm turned on, so hopefully you can hear me. Yeah. Thank you very much. Lovely to be back in Ottawa. It's actually particularly appropriate to be here in this building because when Ailsa is at Edinburgh, and when we were finishing this book, she was downstairs somewhere. She was on study leave. And so we were sending stuff back and forward to each other in the final bits of the process. And she's actually a University of Ottawa product. So you can either claim credit for her, or if you find faults with the book, then you've got to shut up, right? Because it's on you. No. So anyway, so it's particularly appropriate to be here. And it's also particularly appropriate timing. Mike mentioned the death of Queen Elizabeth. I mean, the last couple of weeks have been an extraordinary illustration of the kinds of things that we're talking about in the book. I just thought I'd start by just noting a few of them because it brings home elements of the state, which are this very peculiar state called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the times that we're living in that state. So just think of some of the kind of oddity of what was going on. So one of the first things that happened when Charles became king is that he swore an allegiance as head of the Church of Scotland. That was one of the first things he did. And, you know, I'm sure many of you will be aware of this, but certainly many people in the UK are not aware that we've got 4 different church-state relationships in the UK. And so in Scotland, Charles III is head of the Church of Scotland. He's also head of the Church of England, which are different, theologically different. So he's a Presbyterian in Scotland. He's an Episcopalian in England. And when he crosses the border, I don't know what happens theologically, but you know, yes, but he's not head of that, right? So, so, you know, wars have been fought about this difference, but no, but then in Northern Ireland, there's no established church because the church in Ireland was disestablished in the 19th century because of a dominant, obviously because the population was overwhelmingly Catholic. Neither is there an established church in Wales because the church in Wales was disestablished in the earlier 20th century because we were in those days nonconformist Protestants rather than Anglicans or Episcopalians. So we have 4 different church-state relationships in this state. We also saw, once he ascended to the throne, Charles going on a tour of the capitals. So the monarchy is very obviously an Anglo-Scottish institution, very much so. And the royal family, certainly the late Queen, spent a lot of her time in Scotland and was clearly enjoyed spending her time there. So not a surprise, there's a royal palace just by the Scottish Parliament. Those of you who go to Edinburgh, so, you literally throw a stone over the road and you can hit either the palace or the Parliament, depending on which side of the road you're standing on. There is no royal palace in Wales. There is no royal palace in Northern Ireland, and yet Charles did a tour of the capitals, went to Belfast, came to Cardiff. Interestingly, that would not have happened in the past. When the Queen became the Queen, Cardiff wasn't even the capital city of Wales. Wales had no capital city in those days. And now there's a very much we are a royal family that needs to take these 4 territories seriously. So there's, and I thought that symbolically that the first thing he does is go around the capitals, tells you something interesting about the state. Also then in terms of the commentary, the amount of angst around the commentary, and I'm not sure how much of this has reached Canada, but certainly a lot of the commentary in Scotland was, will somehow the Queen's death and the ascension of Charles to the throne, will it help unify the United Kingdom? There's this perpetual sense of angst about whether Scotland is going to go and in the ref 2 and all this kind of stuff going on. And so there's this, and this bled into the commentary, and this was a kind of feature of the commentary, especially from Scotland. Then, kind of angst number 2 was around this sense of, oh my God, we still matter. The world is looking to us and we still matter. Because this is a really important, I'm going to come back to this in the talk. The world came to London, that proves we still matter, right? And of course, obviously, a lot of what's going on in the UK, and I'll come back to that in a moment, is especially around Englishness, is nostalgia. Nostalgia for a world that appears to have been lost. Interestingly, I kind of slight digression. A pal of mine who works in Westminster in the House of Commons was saying, and we were talking about this a few years ago, and he was saying that the reckoning there was that the funeral that we saw this week will be the last great imperial occasion. This will be the last great imperial occasion. That they suspect that lots of those that they will see what we're seeing already in the Caribbean. So, okay, do we really want to continue with the monarchy? Okay, it's one thing to continue with the Queen, but do we really want to say, yes, Charles? Also, people coming to London, there was a sense of, we're not going to see that kind of thing again. And interestingly, in the news today in the UK, it's very much Charles is talking about a scaled down coronation. And I don't think that's simply about being modest in a period of crisis. It's slight worry about who would turn up. Can we really rely on everybody stopping everything to come along? So there's this, all of this kind of angst, I would call it, going on, and the funeral is being seen, at least momentarily, as a kind of, thankfully we still matter. There's also been, and I think this is also important and related, extreme hostility to people who dared raise difficult questions about empire after the Queen's death. This is not the time. It's never the time, but this is definitely not the time. And people who pointed out that when she became Queen, the British forces were doing unspeakable things in Kenya. I mean, in particular, and we can't talk about this. And real hostility to anybody who's raised it, any academic who's raised it, has been monstered in the press. And this speaks to a kind of, in German terms, an unmastered past, right? Which is very, very obvious. And again, important in terms of this nostalgia, because it was self-evidently better in the past. The difficult bits, the less savory bits are elided. And then finally, and as Mike said, during this whole period, we've had this slightly bizarre process where we've had a regime change. We have a new prime minister. The Boris Johnson phenomenon has crashed and burned remarkably quickly, really. this guy who had so much political capital blew it all up, was removed by his own party. He's been replaced by a leader who enjoys the support of less than half her members of parliament and less than half of her party members. So this is not a particularly solid basis. But interestingly, in terms of what I'm going to be talking about, what's interesting about this is that this is it's all about Brexit. British politics is about Brexit, or has been since 2016 at least. And she represents a very particular take on Brexit. Brexit was a coalition of people who regarded Brexit as an opportunity to reshape the UK as a kind of Singapore based off Western Europe. No regulation or low regulation, low taxes, so on and so forth. But there was also, as part of the coalition, and Nigel Farage and the UKIP Independence Party represented this quite, they're probably the most obvious representatives, who were actually quite keen on state control, quite keen on the states playing an important role in supporting people. So part of the reason why a lot of former Labour supporters were very willing to vote for this. And Boris Johnson kind of straddled this, a foot in both camps. That kind of straddling has now disappeared. Truss is hard rights, hard markets. And so, as the funeral, as the funeral dissipates in terms of its immediate impact, we're now moving into this Truss administration with a fourth Prime Minister in 5 years, ministers changing constantly. So there's absolutely no continuity. And actually now sacking senior civil servants, watch it, Siobhan, who are not seen as being supportive enough of the party line. So again, really radical changes in terms of the way that we understand, because traditionally people understand the UK as being a unitary state, which is very settled and, reliable, and suddenly everything is up in the air. So in terms of this book, which was published a couple of years ago and is coming out in paperback very soon, Ailsa and I wrote this book as you probably worked out from my accent. I'm Welsh. I work on Welsh politics. Ailsa is from Windsor in Ontario, but kind of Scottish Canadian. She runs the Scottish election study. I run the Welsh election study. And so we've decided to write a book about England. And one of the things that we've done, and one of the things that we've done in this book specifically, is we've adopted ideas from the periphery and techniques from the periphery to look at the core of the state. Okay, so the way that people study British politics usually is, certainly anybody who uses data, England is 85% of the whole. So England is enormous, right? Northern Ireland is 3%, Wales is 5%, Scotland about 7%, roughly, okay? And in terms of people writing about British politics, everybody just ignores Northern Ireland completely. So the British election study doesn't even collect data in Northern Ireland. 50, 60 years later, they don't even collect data in Northern Ireland. And then Wales and Scotland get relegated to country specialists. And then we talk about British politics, which is basically about England without ever mentioning England. That's basically how it works. So what we've done is we've taken some of the ideas that will be familiar, very familiar to you from a Canadian context, about identity in particular, and some of the questions that you use in surveys. And actually, what happens if you ask these questions at the core of the state? And as you'll see in a moment, lots of stuff becomes obvious that wasn't previously obvious. So in terms of, and there's a danger that I bore you with the book, and I'm going to try not to do that. We start actually with these two quotes, which highlight something I think quite important. And first of all, who says these things is, so two of the most prominent 20th century British politicians. And even though Tony Blair is reviled these days, still a significant figure. So Churchill, there is a forgotten, nay, almost forbidden word. You need to imagine his voice, not mine, okay? Which means more to me than any other. That word is England. Once we've flaunted it in the face of the whole world like a banner, it was a word of power. But today we are scarcely allowed to mention the name of our country. Okay. So England as this occluded, semi-secret, but deeply resonant thing. And then Tony Blair, this was when he resigned. This is from his resignation speech. This is a blessed nation. The British are special. The world knows it. In our innermost thoughts, we know it. This is the greatest nation on earth. Now, I mean, there are lots of things going on here, but I mean, the idea that nationalism is something that you find in Scotland and Wales and Ireland, but not at the core of the states. I give you this as evidence. So the relationship between Englishness and Britishness is a key theme throughout the book. And we go into a lot of detail, and there's lots of, we've basically done a lot of survey work around these issues going back for about 10 years. We decided that people were kind of ignoring what was going on in England. And when we used to, several people around this table used to live in a little Welsh seaside town called Aberystwyth. And they still, in this little town, have the remnants of what used to be called the Birmingham fortnight. So in the English West Midlands, there was a tradition back in the kind of high industrial period that the factories would close for a couple of weeks and people would head to the nearest seaside, which often was West Wales, right? And there was certainly, during my time in Aberystwyth, I'd noticed more and more holiday makers with kind of kitsch English, there'd be football shirts or flags on cars, or there would be manifestations of Englishness on the promenade by where you lived in this couple of weeks. And there was something going on, and English flags appearing. If you were traveling around England, you'd see English flags flying, and there was something interesting going on. So we started studying this. And when I say one of the things that came into focus is the complicated relationship between Englishness and Britishness, which I'll come back to. So the book focuses initially on the 2015 general election. Now, the 2015 general election is really important because this was an election with a very unexpected result. David Cameron won that election. He hadn't expected to win that election by all accounts. And because they didn't expect to win, one of the things that was included in the Conservative manifesto was a commitment to hold a referendum on European membership, okay? And by all accounts, Cameron never thought that he would be in a position to have to deliver on that hugely consequential, as it turned out, pledge. And Labour were seen as the favourites. There had been a referendum on Scottish independence in 2014. We moved very quickly into preparing for the general election, and Labour was seen as being in the boss seat. But they were absolutely trashed during the campaign. And all of the grey literature, none of the academic literature, interestingly, but all of the grey literature, everybody involved in the campaign says it's this that made the difference. So Labour was expected to win, but not have an overall majority. And because of the way that the 2014 referendum in Scotland had completely transformed Scottish politics, everybody expected the SNP to win most seats in Scotland. Not necessarily, they won almost all of them, but nobody had expected the SNP, the SNP were expected to do very, very well. And it was thought that Labour would need to rely on some arrangement with the SNP in order to govern. So the Conservative campaign focused on the idea that Labour would be under the control of the SNP. And so this is the initial poster they did. So this is Alex Salmond leader of the SNP, and this is Ed Miliband in his pocket. And then during the campaign, Nicola Sturgeon, who's now Scottish First Minister, she took part in the TV debates and was very, very good, very confident. And so then they switched during the campaign to Nicola Sturgeon with Alex Salmond. And this was, and all of their campaign messaging in England was focused on the idea of if you have a minority Labour government, the SNP will be in control. Okay, and it was, I mean, all the testimony from people who were involved in the election say that this was devastatingly effective. Political science didn't ask the right survey questions in order to be able to trace this. So there's a kind of disjuncture, but the people involved were very, very clear about this. And what's particularly revealing is that the people who designed the campaign for Conservatives were very well aware they weren't simply playing with anti-SNP sentiments. So these are the words of Jeremy Sinclair, who actually came up with the campaign for the Conservative Party in a very unguarded set of remarks after the election when he describes what they were doing. Okay, and this is how he described it. We hate being ruled or bossed by foreigners, French, Germans, Scots, anyone, and it looked as though we were going to be run by Alex Salmond. This is the most powerful thing when people are threatened by a government of outsiders. So, I mean, extraordinarily unguarded remarks. When I found those, it was, I mean, it was obvious, partly because, sorry, I digress, but during 2014, the research that we've been doing on the relationship between Englishness and Euroscepticism, which I'll come back to in a moment, had been of great interest to the UK government at the time. And so they'd been asking us for all our data, and they were very interested in particular aspects of it. So they were thinking about the response in England to Scotland, how that related to Europe and all these things already. And at the 2015 election, recall, the UKIP, so Farage's party, was seen as being a big threat. So that's why they had the manifesto commitment to holding a referendum. And they ran this campaign very, very hard in those seats that UKIP were targeting. Because basically you need to vote for us, otherwise the Scots will be in charge, essentially. Okay, so the 2015 general election is a hugely important election because Englishness, there's a very deliberate attempt to mobilize Englishness, explicitly to mobilize Englishness in a way that, had not been seen, certainly in the lifetimes of anybody I know of. And it appeared to be very successful indeed. And, open brackets, and Labour are still trying to work out what to do about this, because you can bet your life that the next UK general election, if it looks like a hung parliament, which is quite possible, this message will come back. So in terms of the argument, so 2015 is core. And so the Conservatives win this wholly unexpected general election by mobilizing Englishness. A few months later, we have the Brexit referendum. England is never mentioned in the campaign. It's all about Britishness. All the symbolism is Union Jacks. It's all about Britain, 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 Britain. And yet, and this is the puzzle that we start the book with, it's the same people who are mobilized by Englishness who vote for Leave. Okay? So the same people who are explicitly mobilized by a campaign around Englishness end up and are clearly unhappy about the idea of Scottish influence, outsiders, then vote for Leave. And so it's who are these people and what's going on here? And we'd already established in our previous work when we started looking at this stuff that there was a very, very strong relationship between English identity and Euroscepticism. So we first went into the field and asked questions about this in 2012. And I don't know if you can see this. It's going to be easier when we come down. So if you can't see the top one, don't worry. Basically, this is the so-called Moreno-Lynch scale of measuring identity. And what we've got is English, not British, more British than English, equally English and British, more British than English, British, not English. And so we found back in 2012 that there was a very, very strong relationship. And it was those people who felt predominantly English who were most likely to support a Leave vote. And despite the fact that Brexiteers use the symbols of Britishness, those people who feel exclusively British are more pro-European, okay? So, and this, the one below, which is easier to read because it's just so striking visually, is these data come from the referendum day poll conducted by Lord Ashcroft, which is an enormous undertaking, very rich businessman who likes to spend money on opinion polling. And this shows you, so blue here is Leave and yellow is Remain. And it's just such a strong relationship between them. And indeed, if you do, we've published about this stuff if you're interested. And what you find is that, yes, this is statistically significant, whatever else you throw in the model. It's absolutely there centrally, whatever else. So a lot of the debate in the UK has been about the left behinds and all these kinds of things. And centre-left academics always want to turn something into a socio-economic issue because it's familiar territory. But this is there. If you control for education, if you control for whatever else, this is absolutely there. And interestingly, it works, and I'll come back to the significance of this in a moment, it works in the opposite way in Scotland and in Wales. So the territorial identity in Scotland and Wales associates with Remain. British identity in Scotland and Wales associates with Leave. Okay, so they're flipped over in Scotland and in Wales. So we've got this, on the one hand, English identity very much associates with Eurosceptic sentiment. Also, these are data from early in our, there's more recent data in the book, but when I started taking photos of the tables, it looked terrible. So it doesn't matter, the relationships are exactly the same. You also find, related to English identity, a strong sense of what we've called Devo-skepticism. Now, Euroscepticism has taken off in the world. We've had no luck in getting Devo-skepticism to take off, but I'm going to keep on plugging away. This is an idea that England gets a raw deal within the UK. Okay? That England's voice is somehow ignored, and in particular, Scotland gets too much stuff. Has too much influence, gets too much stuff. And again, this relates strongly to how English you are. So if you feel strongly English, then you think that Scotland gets more than its fair share of public spending. They do, by the way. I can tell you as a Welshman, they absolutely do. Scottish Parliament should pay for its own services from its own taxes, very strongly. So, well, if you, Scottish MPs should no longer be allowed to vote on English laws, because we have this, as I'm sure you know, this anomaly whereby you've got this asymmetric devolution, which means that Welsh and Scottish MPs in Westminster and Northern Irish MPs can vote on issues for England that have been devolved to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So it's an obvious anomaly. I mean, the numbers, it doesn't often make a difference, but it is an obvious anomaly. The UK government can't be trusted to work in English interests. Again, relates strongly to national identity. So we know that Englishness associates with Euroscepticism. We know that it associates with what we've called Devo-skepticism. Well, and I actually just jump over that because that's just too small. So what we then try and do is, work out how these things work together. And so at the core of the book, we explore what we call the English worldview. So how these things load onto each other to give you an associate with English identity, to give you what we think is a coherent view of the world, and how England/Britain should be governed. And one of the things I want to say is it's not simply about grievance and resentment. There is definitely grievance and resentment in there, and I'm going to talk more about it in a moment. But we also think that there is more to it than that, and it needs to be engaged with more seriously than just to say, well, these are the people, raging at the dying of the light. So what you find is that English identity, and I'm not going to go through the stats on this, but English identity loads with Euroscepticism, as I've said, loads with Devo-skepticism, loads with the idea that English culture is not valued in England. This idea of we're somehow being silenced and ignored. There's a lack of respect for British values and a real veneration of the past and a sense of loss. So a lot of this is a sense of loss for, Britain being a leading part of the world, but also then, more positively, there's a desire for England to be recognised somehow within the state. Now, we'll come back to this in a moment. That's very difficult. One of the issues with that is what seems a very reasonable thing is actually very difficult structurally, given the nature of the state. Also, interestingly, there's a very, very strong idea that the place of Britain is with the Anglosphere, or bits of the Anglosphere. Essentially the white bits of the Anglosphere, not to put too fine a point on it. And actually, I would say a very, very out of date is the kind way to put it, understanding of Canada and Australia and New Zealand. But it's very much there. And again, in the data, if you ask about, so anti-immigration people talk a lot about immigration, and we talk about immigration in the book, but all immigrants aren't equal. So Australians love them, can't have enough Australian immigrants, okay? So it's particular kinds of immigrants from particular places. That's not me, is it? No, it's not my phone. No, okay. So particular kinds of immigrants are unwelcome. Others, absolutely not. And so in the book, we talk about this kind of concentric circles of belonging. And I use this metaphor of like the castle, very Welsh. Obviously, we've got lots of castles. And a kind of concentric circle. So there's an English keep at the heart of it. And then you've got the curtain walls around it. And these walls would consist of Scotland and Wales. Ireland is always ambiguous. But the white Commonwealth, as people used to say, or the white dominions, and then you've got the moats, and beyond that is the other, and the other is people like the French, So there's a real. This is so the idea that the Anglosphere is awaiting Britain to re-emerge from its European kind of its mistake and lead the Anglosphere again is absolutely very widely believed amongst supporters of Brexit. I was talking to a New Zealand diplomat about this. He said, I get these strange letters. Now that we've gone, can we lead you again? And it's like, no, the times have changed. Anyway, so in terms of loading with Englishness, you've got a sense of grievance, definitely, but also this kind of incoherent sense of England should be recognised in some way. And basically, if you ask for various options, this is not a very, very well developed debate. So you ask in surveys, you ask for any option. If you put English or England on the front, it's yay, we'll have that. It's no more sophisticated than that. It's a very strong idea of Britain's place in the world is with this kind of what Churchill used to call the kith and kin, right? And There's also kind of strong sense of parliamentary sovereignty in there. An idea that we didn't get any additional rights from being involved in the European Union. We had everything we needed already. You know, almost Saxons under the tree type stuff. So there's a strong sense of past, sense of, and this works. And if you know the literature on nationalism, you'll be aware there's a lot about this kind of triadic nature of nationalist discourse: the glorious past, the fallen present, and the sunlit uplands that we can reapproach as long as we throw away those things that have brought us down. But there's absolutely at the core of Brexit rhetoric. It's nationalist to its very, very core. The golden age, which was lost, and the golden age, it's very incoherent. It's Second World War is big. Second World War is big, and we don't want to talk about certain things. Massacres in India, no, thank you very much. We civilized the world, but we won't go into detail. Second World War, we saved the world. We were a global power, a trading nation, an island, all this stuff. Now we were brought low by Europe. Now we will re-emerge. Interestingly, British identity in England loads only with English identity. So none of these other things adhere to it. So Britishness is this kind of empty vessel in England, not true in Scotland and Wales. It works differently in Scotland and Wales. Britishness means different things in different parts of the UK. We always knew that. Britishness in East Belfast always felt different if you were brought up in Wales, right? But being, say, if you come, very cliched, if you come from North London and you say, I'm English and not British, that means something very, very different from coming from East Belfast, but also from East Glasgow, frankly, or the South Wales Valley, and says, I'm British. That means something different, okay? And we can show this, but in England, it's an empty vessel. In terms of, for me, the most interesting bit of the book of all is what predicts Englishness. What are the things that, in terms of looking at the population of England, what predicts people will have a kind of high Englishness score? Only three things. Only three things predict this. So it's not about class, it's not about education, it's not about income, there are three things. Gender. Males are more likely to hold this worldview. Place of birth, born in England. Shocker, right? But, and this is the kicker, low efficacy. So for those of you who don't know, efficacy is an idea in political science. Basically, low efficacy is I have no ability to change anything and nobody cares what I think. Okay, that's so the kind of political science notion of efficacy is that if you've got low efficacy, I have no influence, nobody cares what I think, right? And this is overwhelmingly where people with this high Englishness score are in terms of it. They feel that nobody cares. I think, and this is more difficult, we're trying to tease this out in current work. I think this very much relates to the idea of, but we used to matter, okay? We used to have a voice. So obviously that's more difficult to show that kind of causal link, but it's certainly true that low efficacy is key. Nobody cares about me. I've got no way of changing anything. I think that almost certainly relates to the idea of, but we used to matter, which makes it all the more difficult in a sense. So that's at the heart of the book, is showing how these different things load together. And we've got lots of stuff on the symbols of nationhood and the difficulty people have in teasing out Englishness from Britishness because they're so mutually implicated. One of the arguments which we make, which I'm just not going to go into any detail, but it's maybe worth making to this audience, is that we think that English nationalism is often misidentified because people expect it to be like Scottish, Welsh, and Irish nationalism. And in their 20th century, guys, Scottish, Irish, and Welsh nationalisms are a rejection of Britishness. Right? They weren't. One of the interesting things about this is they were not that. If frankly, if Britain had taken a saner line on Ireland historically, the Irish independence would probably never have happened. Because if you look at the Irish Parliamentary Party, even Arthur Griffith and some of the people in Sinn Féin, Arthur Griffith wanted the British monarch they wanted a dual monarchy a la Austria-Hungary. So, but anyway, in the 20th century, they become a rejection of Britishness. And people expect to see English nationalism rejecting Britishness. But it's not. It's a valorization of a particular idea of Britain. Absolutely. So they've got this weird kind of Janus-faced England inside the States, and we get a bad deal from these nasty Scots in particular, but Britain facing the world. So it's this kind of Janus-faced thing, and people expect it to look like Irish or Scottish or Welsh nationalism, and it's obviously not. So where am I? So I'm kind of skating through this quite quickly, so we have some time to talk. Just in terms of, where do you end up with this? We talk about there are kind of two things that we go on to talk about is, okay, what does this mean politically and constitutionally? How do you accommodate if you can accommodate? And then we go on to talk about what this means for political science and for people studying Britain. And I'm not going to talk about the latter part at all because it gets quite navel-gazing. But in terms of accommodating England, so now that Englishness is there, what do you do about it? The centre-left answer is regionalise England, right? Cut England up into Scotland-sized chunks of around 5 million people-ish, right? And give them regional governments, which will balance out the UK constitution. So you'll have devolution within England as well as for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And somehow this will be okay. Somehow this will dissipate it all. And this is still the idea that Labour is playing with. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has got Gordon Brown leading a commission, the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and no one is keener on regionalising England than Welsh and Scottish Unionists, right? The problem is the English don't want to be regionalised. It's a big, big problem because we've tried asking this question because we always get this. We've tried asking it for different units. Basically, public opinion in England is hostile to any significant regional empowerment. And I say this personally with regret. England is weirdly centralised, to the point that Whitehall runs every school in England. Local government in England has been emasculated to the point where even schools are run out of London these days. It's all so centralised. So I say with some regret, but nonetheless, public attitudes are really not there for regionalisation. And also, the logical problem with this is, unless you say we're going to establish regional parliaments for, say, the northeast of England with the same powers as the Scottish Parliament, which with their own legal system and all, which I've never heard anybody suggest, you're still going to have England as a residual unit in some way, okay? So regional government, that's the centre-left preferred idea, remains the centre-left preferred idea. Then the idea that the Conservatives had was English votes for English laws. So basically the idea was, let's try to alter the internal rules of the House of Commons to ensure that you can't have Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish MPs voting on issues that are England only, which sounds really straightforward in practice. Well, ish, okay. There was yeah, you're right. But, superficially, it sounds okay. However, there are all kinds of practical difficulties, one of which is that all public spending decisions for England end up determining how Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are funded. Because the way that territorial funding works in the UK is it's all based on what happens in England, right? And then there's a formula which then spreads money to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So basically anything with a funding dimension in England has territorial implications beyond England. So anyway, so this was the Conservative idea. It was in their manifestos for years. They implemented it in 2015. They got rid of it at the start of the COVID crisis. They've decided it's not coming back. It existed for about 4 years. Not a single vote was changed by this mechanism, right? Because when the Conservatives are in power, and we'll come back to this in a moment, you know, it's an English-based party. And so it would only affect the Labour government. Okay, so they've tried that and made no difference. Most people weren't aware that it was even implemented for the period that it was implemented. So the current UK government is trying something else, which is what we call muscular unionism. The rhetoric coming out of the UK government over the last 2 years has been incredibly hostile to devolution. Not only hostile to Scotland, but equally hostile to the Welsh government. The Welsh government is led by the Labour Party, Unionist Party. You know, the UK government is equally hostile to both the SNP in Scotland and Labour in Wales. And indeed, Truss was gratuitously rude during her election campaign. You know, anyway. So the whole idea is that devolution was implicitly, at least, and actually pretty explicitly, was a mistake, but we can't do anything about it. But we are going to use Brexit as a way of re-centralising power. So they've already re-centralised economic development powers. We're seeing a push on some education powers, so that this is happening. So the issue with this is that there is no democratic route to ending devolution. There's very, very strong support for devolution in Scotland and in Wales. So, you know, you can't, going down that route is very, very fraught. And I don't think is deliverable. And also the point about the UK, and this is something that a politics audience will understand the implications of immediately. Political choices, vote choice in the three, let's ignore Northern Ireland for a moment, but in Britain, so in Scotland, Wales and England, patterns of vote choice are so different. So I put these two dates down, 1859 and 1959. Those are the dates where the Conservative Party last won the popular vote in Wales and in Scotland. And the popular vote in Wales in 1859 involved 4,000 people, okay? This was long, long before democracy. So the Conservatives last won a general election in Wales in 1859, last won the popular vote in Scotland in 1959. Labour have only won the popular vote in England 7 times in the party's history. Okay, so you know, Conservatives dominate in England. By now, the SNP dominate completely in Scotland, and on November the 15th of this year, we're marking the 100th anniversary of Labour winning every election in Wales. A feat which is, you know, non-parallel. It's incredible what they've managed to achieve. So the point about the UK is, with devolved parliaments organised on a national basis for Scotland and Wales, representing the political preferences of those places, muscular unionism is incredibly dangerous because it is imposing a vision of the state and of, you know, what the true identity should be, that is simply not shared by people in Scotland and Wales who feel Scottish or Welsh. We published something last week, actually, if you're interested, showing that Conservative voters in Scotland and Wales, actually, a plurality of them don't think that there is a Scottish or Welsh nation, even. Whereas in England, Tory voters, there's an English nation and there's a British nation. Most voters in Wales and Scotland think there's a Scottish nation or a Welsh nation and a British nation. But Conservatives in Scotland and Wales now think there's just the British nation. So they're really out of step here. And so you can get into very, very deep waters. And I think they will get into deep waters. What are the other options out there? Well, independence for Scotland and Wales, the unification of Ireland. I think you've got a talk coming up relatively soon, which will touch on Scotland. Brexit has given a renewed boost to independence in Scotland. It wasn't clear what would bring independence back onto the political agenda in Scotland after 2014. We needed to wait 2 years, and lo and behold, Brexit has done that. As you know, the polls are basically 50-50 in Scotland. The UK government is saying no, never, but I don't know. Remarkably, Brexit has spurred on the development of an independence movement in Wales. So we're now at the stage where around 30% of people in Wales say they'd vote for independence if there was a referendum, which is, yeah, it's about 2 to 1, which is just, I'd never expected that. It's now standard amongst my Labour supporting students to be in favour of Welsh independence. Standard, Labour supporting students, right? Okay, so it's had this big impact in making this a kind of thinkable thing. I think what's happening, certainly I can speak with more authority on Wales on this, but I think what's happening is that those people who are quite happy with the idea of multiple layered identities, well, we can be European, British, Welsh, and we don't have to choose. We want a Welsh layer of government. Yeah, sure, the British layer of government can do something helpful, and the European. Brexit means you have to choose, and also the direction in which the UK is going post-Brexit is not a very attractive one for lots of these people, so particularly young people, right? So that's happening. And then you've got reunification of Ireland as something that has come up the agenda in a really dramatic way. And interestingly, there's been a change amongst the kind of thinking unionists in Wales that I know, who tend to regret most of this stuff. But they basically, there's now a sense, well, Ireland should reunify. You find very few people making a principled case for Northern Ireland remaining within the state. And there's a real, if the UK is going to go into a trade war with the European Union because it's unwilling to actually live up to the pledges it's made on the protocol, who knows? But I mean, all of these things, there are all kinds of questions about all of these things and how practical they are. Brexit makes independence more difficult practically, obviously, because the whole premise of Scottish independence in 2014 was we can retain the single market. We don't need to worry about that stuff. And so we can have our political independence and economically very little changes. That's gone. Okay, that's gone. So politically it makes the case for independence easier, but economically difficult. And even if certainly not, if Northern Ireland went, nobody would care. I mean, brutally. The stats on that are remarkable. Nobody cares, basically, or very, very few people care. A lot of people would like to see Northern Ireland parts of the Republic. But it's hard to envisage how Scotland and even Wales could go without a lot of resentment, a sense of betrayal, all this kind of stuff. So, so even if this were to happen, I suspect there would be deep unhappiness persisting. And it does feel a little bit like we're just we're in this perpetual crisis. I mean, if you study elections in the UK, 2014 Scottish referendum, 2015 UK general election, 2016 devolved elections, 2017 general election, 2019 general election. We are struggling. Those of us who work at elections are just kind of overwhelmed with all of this. And it's just, it is endlessly changing ministers, endlessly changing prime ministers. It seems very febrile. This, the whole, if you go back and look, and I'll just stop with, if you go back and look at the textbooks, we had a colleague, Mike Foley, who you will remember fondly, and he wrote a very interesting book on the British Constitution, where he just started out with quotes from textbooks, which are about how stable the UK was, how sensible it was, how it was the model. And, you know, it just seems bizarre. And people used to make fun about Italian governments. I remember being a child, they've got a new government in Italy, you know, it was a kind of punchline. But that is the contemporary UK. Right, and I'm going to stop with that. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Richard. We have about half an hour for questions. Anna is going to take any questions that come through the chat. But please, if you could identify yourself, keep your questions substantive and hopefully relatively short. I think Anna will bring the microphone around and we'll go from there. Alan, please.
You're going to be running around.
Yeah. Ready to go.
And Richard, I'll let you point to people.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Hi, I'm Alan Freeman. I'm an honorary senior fellow here at GISPIA, and I was a correspondent in the UK from '98 to 2004. So it's getting a while yet. One of the things that you didn't mention in your fabulous presentation was England's a big place.
Yeah.
There's the South and there's the North. You've got the whole Boris Johnson leveling up,
Yeah.
which seems to have been aimed at saying, you know, the North has been cheated for years. All the money goes to the South, it goes to London. So are you saying that people in Bradford or Hull or wherever who are not doing particularly well resent Edinburgh more than they resent London? And doesn't the whole remain, and how does that division within England play into this whole sense of Englishness? I would think a lot of people in London feel very, very British or European and not very English.
That's a fantastic question. Do you want me to, how do you want to do this, Michael? Do you want to take one? Okay. Thank you, Alan. That's a really great question. Again, there's a danger I get lost in a lot of detail here. So we have been, because it's a standard retort is, well, actually, England is very distinctive internally. They've got all these kind of regional differences, and there's regional resentment, idea that London gets too much stuff, and surely, therefore, there isn't uniformity on things like a sense that Scotland gets too much and all these kinds of things. So we've spent a lot of time trying to survey this, and surveys are imperfect, but we do our best. And one of the things we've done is try to shift the regional framing, because there are 9 official regions in England, but you know, most people don't know what the borders are and have no sense of what they are. So we've also then tried the North or the Midlands, so we've tried every which way we can think. And what we find is that, yes, there are regional identities. You know, there's a sense of I'm a Scouser or whatever, right? But they don't seem to be political. They don't seem to then, there seems to be no relationship between that and we are a natural political unit of any kind. And indeed, the intra-regional rivalries are often so strong that, you know, Newcastle and Sunderland, you know, no way, you know, that so, and also there's uniformity in terms of the with one exception, which I'll come back to. There's uniformity in terms of the strength of English identity. There's uniformity in terms of the stuff around devo-skepticism and all these things. So it's that London is the only outlier. So, and the reason that London is an outlier, and I don't want to oversell the outlyingness of London either, but British identity is stronger there than English identity. Okay, and that appears to relate to the ethnic makeup of the population and maybe age as well. But so there's a kind of interesting dimension around Black and ethnic minority communities, where in Scotland, we have no data from Wales, unfortunately, but in Scotland, those communities tend to assimilate as Scottish. In England, they tend to assimilate as British. Okay, so there's something interesting. Yeah, so there's something interesting going on there. So London is a partial outlier, but I wouldn't over egg that either. There's remarkable uniformity on the stuff that we're talking about, and we've really looked. All right, so for example, you know, regional government, the idea of regional government, which was Labour's big idea back in the late 1990s. Very low support for that. So then it shifted to city regions. Well, it turns out the only thing less popular than regional governments is city regions. So, you know, you can go around the houses on this stuff, and it's pretty uniform, with London as the only partial outlier.
We have to.
Oh, you have to, okay. I was wondering why we need the microphone here. Well, thanks for the talk. I'm André Lecourt. I'm from the School of Political Studies.
Ailsa said hi.
Oh, well, hi back. And I guess the first thing I want to say is I think it's really important work, obviously doing something on, you know, what we called 10 years ago in an edited volume, majority nationalism,
Yeah.
right? And there just hasn't been a lot either before or since. So I think it's great. This being said, I'll play devil's advocate a little bit with you here and ask you, so if Englishness is as significant and as potent a force as you say it is, why is it that the UK government isn't not accepting a second referendum on Scottish independence and just, you know, live with it? You would think that, you know, if it's all about England, then why is there a care in the world about, you know, a second referendum in Scotland that might or might not work, but even if it leads to independence there, you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you, Andre. One of the things that we did after the Brexit referendum, and we have it on very good authority, was put it in a file in front of Boris Johnson in his first day as Prime Minister, although he never read any files, so I'm not gonna claim that he saw it. Was we did a piece of work after the referendum, which was about what were people willing to give up in order to get their way on Brexit. Okay, so we asked people, you know, to get your preferred outcome on Brexit, would you be happy to see a second Scottish independence referendum and a yes vote? And we asked at the end of the Irish peace process, which we thought was pretty, you know, that's pretty nuclear, we thought, or the end of the Irish peace process and the reunification of Ireland. So we tried these things, and what we found was shocked a lot of people, which was that in England and indeed in Wales, something like 80% or even higher, might have been 85%, but let's just say 80% of conservative Leave voters were happy to sign up to either of those to get their own way on Brexit. And also a smaller proportion of Remainers. So, but a majority of Remainers, right? But a smaller proportion. We also find there's lots of ambivalence around the union in England. You know, yeah, we don't want it to go away, but neither are we willing to do anything to keep it. So I think that the UK government, or the position at the UK level, a couple of things going on. One of which is that you still have at the elite level a group of politicians from the devolved countries in the unionist parties who are very, very wedded to the state and who still have influence, and indeed managed to persuade some of their colleagues that they speak for the silent majority of those countries. So part of it is how the elites are constructed, but also, you know, I am not convinced that when push comes, we'll see. I mean, we'll see. They're not going to say yes, take the second referendum and go. But to what extent they resist, we still don't know. So I mean, I take your point, but it's always struck me very forcibly. Sorry, this is very anecdotal, but nonetheless, it was something that struck me. My first visit to Madrid, talking to Spanish civil servants, and the way they talked about the idea of Catalan independence was with such vitriolic opposition. It was existential in a way that you simply don't get when you talk to civil servants in London about the UK. It's, Great Britain would still be great and British, even if the Scots went. And certainly in Northern Ireland, yeah, absolutely. And who cares about Wales? But whereas Catalonia goes, and that's Spain is gone. The Spain that we understand has gone. So I take your point, but I'm not sure that it is as hard and fast as maybe the rhetoric implies. Yeah.
And then we have an online question.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you so much. My name is Srđan Vučetić. I'm a professor at JISPIA. Big fan of your works, such a big fan. In fact, we did the podcast when the book was just about to come out. And great to see you in person. So
thank you.
2 questions. First, it might be silly. How did Brexit lose its politics? In 2016, millions of people voted Remain. What happened? Is there a political force associated with this vote or voting bloc, so to speak, today? And how
with Remain?
Yeah.
Okay.
How would it manifest itself potentially today or in the future? And I don't mean necessarily with respect to the European Union, but say with respect to Europe more broadly, European political community, as Macron would like to put it, and so forth. A second question might be also silly. You said earlier, who cares about Wales? Under what conditions do you see Wales becoming a member of the United Nations?
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
So again, 2 really good questions, and really good to see you as well. I enjoyed the podcast. That was fun. It's very with Remain. First of all, for those of you not aware, Remain became more of a thing after the Brexit vote than it was before the Brexit vote. And that's one of the, if you like, the tragedies of contemporary British politics, is that the enthusiasm for European membership manifested after it was too late for it to make any difference at all. And since then, there was this very, very long parliamentary process which ended in complete stalemate, and then the 2019 general election vote then breaks the stalemate, at least for a while. And my view is that it's too early to tell what happens to Remain. I don't want to get, is it Chou En-lai who talks about or is it who talks about the French Revolution and says it's too early to tell. So I think that it's too early to tell, because we've also had COVID in the interim. But my view is at the moment, a lot of Remainers are on sufferance buying the Labour Party line that we need to bury this and not talk about it in order to try and win the next general election and try and move towards sanity, as they would regard it. Starmer is safe to say that he's not pulling up any trees in terms of creating any enthusiasm for him. But in the context of Johnson, such was the abhorrence of Johnson amongst Remainers that you've got to give him a chance. But what's interesting is that there is, in terms of values, in terms of there's more enthusiasm about the European Union in the UK now than there's ever been. That's absolutely the case. And I don't think that, and if the Starmer project fails, which it may well do, I mean, the Conservatives are pretty much doing everything they can to help Labour at the moment, but you'd have to think at some point they stop digging. Although every time I hear the news and it's, what, you're going to do that? Yes, at this point in the crisis, what we need is lower taxes for bankers. That's, it's a winning strategy. But I think it's there and will manifest itself in all kinds of ways, cultural and political, and they are doing so. But I couldn't, I think it's a really good question. I wish I could give you a better answer. In terms of the Welsh position, Wales is been fascinating over the last few years because it's changed so quickly in ways that had not been expected. And I'm dumbstruck often in conversations I have around kind of political Wales, where people who would be senior political people in the unionist parties would be saying, well, if Scotland, first of all, if Scotland goes, everything changes. There's a weird, so basically it's Northern Ireland should go. That makes sense. We don't want Scotland to go, but if Scotland goes, it changes everything. And I often ask about the psychology of this, because if I said earlier, England is 85% of the current whole, Scotland is 7%, we're 5%. So, you know, if Scotland goes, we're already we're a small minority. We become an even smaller. But psychologically that appears to be very, very different. And there are politicians, very senior Labour politicians in Wales, who will, I mean, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, who's easily the most popular politician in Wales, says, the UK is broken. The union is broken. It has to be rebuilt in a fundamentally different way. And it's very clear that if Scotland were to go, that would lead to a wholesale change in the nature of the debate, because there then would be a sense, well, you're going to get permanent Conservative governments who don't accept the legitimacy of the Welsh level of government, and so that would change a lot. Labour wins in Wales by being a small N nationalist party, and that has implications.
Okay, so we will read a question here from Claude Denis. So this was a question online.
Yeah.
A double question. What are the coordinates of low efficacy?
Yeah.
Class, education, ? And how does this interact with gender? How much is this an expression of masculinity in crisis?
Oh. Right. Okay. No.
Thank you for the question.
No, brilliant. Two fantastic questions. So, I mean, this is the thing about the coordinates of low efficacy. Let me take a step back. In the immediate aftermath of the referendum, there was this whole kind of anguished, and universities in particular was a very noticeable thing in universities. We're out of touch with the left behinds. There's this phrase, the left behinds. And the Brexit vote was seen as being an expression of the frustration of the people who've been left behind by globalization. And there were all kinds of stuff being written, the people from somewhere and the people from nowhere. I mean, all this stuff is, and so it was the people from somewhere revolting against the cosmopolitans who float around. And so this became ubiquitous. The problem was it was really dreadful social science for many reasons, but one of them was they systematically excluded Northern Ireland and Scotland from the analysis. Okay, and Scotland and Northern Ireland had voted to remain. Scotland heavily to remain, and Wales is too small to. So some of the poorest bits of Wales voted remain. So, but it got turned into a socio-economic thing, and then Ailsa and I and a couple of other people, we've done a piece analysing all the data that we can find from using Scottish data as well, testing the various theories and including the national identity stuff. And the national identity stuff survives everything else. And it's not, so class and education, all the things that people focus on, it's usually using a very small, basically very few respondents outside of England, and then using Britishness as a dummy variable, assuming that Britishness means the same thing everywhere in Britain, which it doesn't, absolutely doesn't. So this kind of low efficacy thing, which as I said, we're doing more on this because we just think this is fascinating. Probably also, I wonder if this helps you understand some of the kind of right-wing populism stuff that you and I keep, well, the three of us keep talking about. So it appears that, so in terms of what aligns, there seems to be an independent effect related to Englishness here. It's not simply about class or anything else. So there's something about your sense of national identity that's related to this in some way. And we're trying to work out, so we're trying to think about this, and we've got some exciting stuff on the way, and Ailsa will kick me if I talk too much about it. But I mean, I hope we can say more about this at the moment, soon, but not at the moment. But all I say is it seems to be independent of class or education or something. There's something identity related going on here, which I think is really interesting, and how that relates to national identity is important. In terms of the crisis of masculinity, yeah, I just don't know. I mean, like I said, low efficacy, Englishness, male, they seem to go together. I could see how you could turn this. There could be a very interesting feminist reading of all of this, but I can't give it to you.
One more question.
I was just gonna, there's another question online, and then I will come to this question.
Okay, so and I'll keep my answer short. Okay.
We still have
I
about
talked too much.
13 minutes.
Oh,
Okay. So I will ask a question, and I just excuse my pronunciation. So it is from Anastasia Llewellyn, who starts her question with Diolchian Varyan.
oh, da iawn, da iawn. Diolch yn fawr. She said, thank you very much in Welsh. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. You started by mentioning how Charles immediately toured the four capitals. Before he even did that, he named his son Prince of Wales.
Oh.
Not only that, but he visited Cardiff on a Wyn Glyndwr Day, a day celebrating Welsh resistance to the English. Could this be seen as an attempt to reinforce a unified Britishness, an attempted assimilation, or even an erasure of Welshness?
Yeah.
With a rise in independent sentiment in Wales, is this not a risky strategy on Charles's part? Thank you for this question.
Yeah, I'm going to try and write something about this on the plane on the way home. So yeah, so this is the subject of a great deal of controversy at the moment in Wales. What I'd say is that there's and for my nationalist friends, the fact that William was named Prince of Wales is a subject of huge annoyance. Michael Sheen, the actor, has got a brilliant. If you want, he's on Twitter about this. He's got this speech which is amazing. Sheen he's an incredible character and a great public speaker. So the reason why it's a subject of annoyance is because the whole idea of the Prince of Wales title is when Wales was conquered, Wales was given to the elder son of the King of England as a kind of, here you are, here's Wales, guys. And there's a lot of invented tradition around this subsequently, but that still for Welsh nationalists, that's not great. The optics aren't good, shall we say? Okay, so there's quite a big petition which has been going on over the last week with people signing up to say this shouldn't happen. So you've got that. On the other hand, I think my personal view is that this was a mistake. To announce William as this was a mistake because it just creates resentment where he didn't need to do it. What's interesting is that on the one hand is counterbalanced by the fact that he comes to Wales. That would not have happened in 1952. Wales is now being recognised as a constituent part of the state in a way that was the first generation of Welsh nationalists, people like Lloyd George, because he started out as a Welsh nationalist, getting Wales recognised as part of Britain, not just simply annexed to England, was a big, and so in a sense, and this is going to be the argument I'm going to write on the plane on the way home. So basically, what happened with Charles coming to Wales, and I think the Glyndwr Day was a complete coincidence. I'm sure that I don't think that anybody in London sits, oh, it's the 16th of September. Oh, what day could that be? It's only, no. So I think that's probably just. I don't think there was anything in that, but I think that him coming to Wales, speaking quite a lot of Welsh and making these things was a kind of the victory of the first generation of Welsh nationalism. That's what you wanted, guys. But the second generation, that's not enough. We want to get. The idea is look, let's stop treating as a conquered nation. Let's give us, recognition as something other than a place you conquered a long time ago. So that's, I think, what's going on. But thank you, Anastasia.
Thanks very much, Siobhan Hardy, former colleague of Richard's, and delighted to see you again. Thanks so much for the talk. So I just wanted to go back and reflect on that complex interplay between Britishness and Englishness. Yeah. And I'm wondering your views on, is there something the Conservative Party can do to navigate its way through that to get to a majority? Are we kind of doomed to perpetual minorities? Is there a way that they can take that and looking at the entirety of the electoral map and be able to capitalize on it or find a strategy to get through to a majority? Yeah.
Not Labour.
No, Conservatives.
Well, the Conservatives can keep on keeping on. I mean, the thing about, because England is so dominant in terms of the state, the Conservatives can govern with very, very limited consent in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, because England is so big and they're redistributing seats. So Wales, we're losing 20% of our seats in Westminster in the next general election. So there'll be, so they can govern without Scotland, without the consent of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Indeed, basically pretty much always do in the case of Wales. So they can do it. The question is how they do it. Do they have the wisdom to show self-restraint or not? And I think that's the thing which is in question. So we had this extraordinary thing a couple of weeks ago where Lord Frost, who was ended up as the chief negotiator on the Brexit deal, was saying essentially saying you can't call Scotland and Wales nations anymore, because that is, basically that's the waiting room to separatism. Well, people have been calling them that for centuries. You can't change that, Lord Frost. But it's part of this kind of delegitimating devolved government, even the identities of these places, which is, first of all, that's not the Conservative tradition in Scotland, historically speaking, which was always quite comfortable with kind of Scottishness and Britishness, and so that it's pursuing a single accepted official version of state identity in what, as I started off by saying, a place with 4 different church-state relationships, a really complicated place, but you're coming at this with this really crude, centralizing, homogenizing mindset, which is not going to work. So when just final thoughts on all of this is, one of the things which is the changes over the last 5 years is the extraordinary changes in the Conservative Party itself, which is Britain's governing party historically. The purging of all the Europhiles. Anybody who was even vaguely pro-European has been purged. There's a kind of race in terms of purity. Your Euroscepticism has to be more and more and more pure. So the party's getting more and more unrepresentative and isolated. And I think that's really dangerous for them as well as for the state, because we're seeing this approach, which makes a statecraft, it's nonsense. It might win you elections, might well win you elections, but a statecraft, it's an absolute nonsense. Oh.
On that note, 2 quick things to say before I thank Richard.
By the
first, yeah, I'll get to that. The first is that Scotland has come up a number of times in this conversation, and it is a good chance for me to promote another talk that we have coming up this fall on the 10th of November. Members of the new Scottish Council on Global Affairs will be here in Ottawa holding a series of meetings. And one of the things that they're planning on doing, and we are lucky enough to have them doing, is coming to do a session with us here at CIPS. So from 11 o'clock until 12:30 on November 10th, if you're interested on the topic of Scotland in a changing world order, please do come along. Secondly, it only remains for me to thank Richard Wyn Jones. Earlier this week, I found out, or actually just over a week ago, Englishness, Political Force Transforming Britain, was named by the Wall Street Journal, no less, as one of 8 books that are
seven
books, that are essential for understanding Britain under the reign of Elizabeth II. So if even the Wall Street Journal says it's good, then it must be good. But as we can see from today, it is good. And thank you, Richard, so much for coming and telling us all.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming along.